In the Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and various supplements, there's lots of rules for things you probably didn't even know about, which are so niche in their applications that some of them even say they're basically optional, because they don't want to muddy down the game with too many mechanics for simple things. So in this list, we're going to look at some of those rules which technically exist, but rarely if ever show up in games for whatever niche reasons. Starting off at number 10, we have tying for initiative. This is probably the most general rule that will be on this list, which is why it's only the number 10 spot. And the ruling for this is what happens if two people roll the same number on initiative, and how you decide who goes first in initiative order. It is commonly ruled that whoever has the higher dexterity score gets priority in the turn order, when actually the rules for a tied initiative is that the DM simply decides the order for the initiative if it's an NPC creature, and the players get to decide amongst themselves which characters go first if it's player characters. And if there is a tie between a player and a DM-controlled creature, then the DM gets to decide who goes first, or the DM can call for another roll of another dice that they want in order to decide who goes first. Now, creatures rolling the same number initiative is something that definitely comes up much more often than a lot of other things on this list. But all of this time, I thought whoever just had the high dex score went first, so I was kind of surprised to find out that's not how it's written in the Player's Handbook, which is why I thought I should share this one fact with you guys at the number 10 spot. And at number 9, we have Suffocating. If you ever fall into a body of water and start to drown, how long are you able to stay underwater before you start actually taking damage? Well, that's where the suffocation rules come into play. A creature is able to hold its breath for at least 1 minute plus its constitution modifier minutes. So if you have a 14 constitution score, then you can hold your breath for 3 minutes, since that 14 would give you additional 2 minutes of breath thanks to your constitution modifier. However, if you have a negative constitution modifier, you don't have a negative amount of minutes you can hold your breath, because the minimum time is 30 seconds. Once a creature runs out of breath, it's able to survive for a number of rounds equal to its constitution modifier. So in the given example, if you have a constitution score of 14, you can survive for 2 rounds before you suffer negative effects, or a minimum of 1 round if you have a 0 or negative constitution modifier. And finally, at the start of your next turn, you drop to 0 hit points and then start dying, or you roll death saves like normal. So you might be able to live for an additional 2 rounds after falling unconscious. However, I will say, in nearly every game that I've ever played, including one that took place almost entirely on a boat and around islands surrounded by water, I've never once needed the rules for suffocating because generally, players or creatures have found ways to get out of the water, and it's just never really been a viable way of dealing damage, because it's much faster to just do damage normally to a creature than it is to try to drown it. Especially since it would take a minimum of 30 seconds, which is 5 rounds of combat, and that's the length of a normal combat encounter. Plus, monsters typically have high constitution scores anyway. And at number 8, we have going without a long rest. Have you ever wondered what the negative side effects of never performing a long rest are? Well, just like the previous example, I've never run or been in a game where players weren't dying to have a long rest in order to recover all their resources. However, there are rules in Xanathar's Guide to Everything where there are negative consequences for players that routinely don't sleep. Basically, the rules are, if you want to account for the effects of sleep deprivation, whenever a player goes 24 hours without finishing a long rest, you can have the character perform a DC 10 Constitution saving throw, otherwise suffer 1 level of exhaustion. Then the DC increases by 5 for every additional 24-hour period after the first that they go without a long rest. So, on day 2 with no sleep, they have a DC 15 Constitution save, which goes up to a DC 20 on day 3, and so on and so on. The DC does not reset to 10 until you finish a long rest. So the rules are pretty fair when it comes to giving exhaustion, because it's kind of easy to avoid the first check with only a DC 10, but once a DC becomes 15, then it becomes a lot harder to avoid. And simply taking a long rest removes 1 level of exhaustion, which also resets the DC back to its base value. So the rules for this are actually pretty in line with how sleep deprivation might work on actual humans who go too long without sleeping. Although if you go way too long without sleeping with this rule, there is the possibility that you reach 6 levels of exhaustion and die, and pretty easily too, because the DC will just get really high to the point where there's no way to reasonably succeed the save. And at number 7, we have the rules for tying a knot. Have you ever been in a situation where your character's backstory has it so they're really good at tying knots, like maybe a sailor or pirate, and you get into a situation where tying a super good knot would probably be beneficial? Well, luckily there is actually rules for this exact scenario. If you wish to tie a knot in order to show the effectiveness of that knot and make it harder to get out of, what you can do is perform an intelligence sleight of hand check, and it is specifically intelligence and not dexterity, which is usually used for sleight of hand, in order to show the innate knowledge of knowing how to tie a knot. Then, based on your super good knot that you just tied, whatever roll you get for the sleight of hand check becomes the DC to beat for a creature to untie that knot with their own intelligence-based sleight of hand check, or for them to slip out of it with a dexterity acrobatics check. And likewise, you are also able to slip out of a knot with the same kind of checks if you so choose. This is one of the few official rules that actually swaps out the normal attribute of a check with something else, while this is actually a variant rule for other scenarios. The whole knot tying thing is more of a variant rule anyways, as you don't need to perform an intelligence-based sleight of hand check every time you wish to tie a knot, because even the rules for tying knots mentions that there's no reason to have the check for mundane activities. The rules I just explained are for players who want to try to tie an especially extravagant knot, or escape one, and not really one your DM should force you to do every time you're trying to tie a rope. And at number 6, we have casting while moving. In order to ritual cast something, a feature that almost all spellcasters have access to, you must spend 10 minutes casting the spell in addition to whatever cast time of the spell is, which allows you to cast the spell without expending a spell slot. And ritual casting is very good, because being able to use spells without a spell slot is just great value. However, since it takes 10 minutes to actually perform a ritual cast, most of the time that 10 minutes is just hand-waved, and also it's usually done outside of combat. But there are some special rules that apply when you're ritual casting a spell, where any spell that takes longer than an action or reaction to cast requires you to maintain concentration on that spell for the whole cast time, because if you lose concentration, the spell will just fizzle out and fail to cast. But at least losing concentration does not expend a spell slot. The only thing that happens is you have to start over. Also, you are allowed to move while casting a ritual spell. You don't actually have to stand still for the whole 10 minutes. So it's possible to just get one prepped while you're going through a dungeon in order to have it ready at maybe some other location that you have to walk to. Although you definitely don't want to get into combat while trying to finish a ritual cast, because you have to spend each of your turns using your action to cast that one spell, and that one spell only, while maintaining your concentration on it, which leaves you unable to do really anything else. And at number 5, we have sleeping in armor. Now, I'm sure most people know about the niche rules when it comes to putting on and taking off armor, and how it can take a long time to remove heavy armor, as it takes 10 minutes to just put it on. And because it takes so long to don and doff armor, most of the time characters will just never take it off, even going so far as to sleep in it, just in case they're attacked in the middle of the night, which basically makes the rules for donning and doffing armor only really matter for cases like being the target of a heat metal spell. However, there are extra rules that can be applied if a character is sleeping in their armor, which are detrimental to the point where characters might actually take off their armor before going to sleep. In Xanatar's Guide to Everything, they have extra rules about penalties for sleeping in medium or heavy armor. If you sleep in light armor, you have no such adverse effects. However, if you finish a long rest while sleeping in heavy or medium armor, you only regain 1/4 of your spent hit die, where normally you recover half of them after a long rest. In addition, if you had any levels of exhaustion, they won't be reduced after long rest, where normally you lose at least 1 level of exhaustion after a long rest. You still, however, gain back all abilities that refresh in a long rest, and still heal up to full health. So the only penalties are to the amount of hit dice you recover, and the rule of recovering 1 level of exhaustion after a long rest. So it is detrimental with these rules, but not game-punishingly so. If you want to encourage your players to actually remove their armor during a long rest because you want to ambush them in the middle of the night, then adding these rules will definitely encourage them to say that they remove their armor before sleeping. And at number 4, we have alien technology. Sometimes in a campaign, your characters might come across strange items that's from different timelines or dimensions altogether. Maybe your characters run across a calculator that somehow got traveled through time and space to their medieval time period. Or maybe they stumble across an alien ship full of antimatter rifles. If a character finds an object that's definitely outside of what they should know, there are rules in place for figuring out how alien technology is supposed to work, and the rules are just a series of intelligence checks, where in order to figure out something simple, like maybe a cigarette lighter or a calculator, it requires 2 successes, but something more complicated like a computer or a hovercraft can require up to 4 successes, based on how complicated you think the item is to figure out. In order to succeed on the checks, all you get to do is just roll higher than a 15. If you roll 14 or lower, then you have 1 failure. And the rules suggest having the item break if you fail 4 or more times before you're taking a long rest. There's also a little table for figuring out the alien technology, where if you roll lower than a 9, you have disadvantage on your next check. But if you roll higher than a 20, you have advantage on your next check instead. And there are some official modules that randomly throw alien technology at your characters, where they give you the rules in the module so your characters have a chance to use it. But I don't want to spoil any ice-based campaigns where this might be the case, so I will not say what the alien tech is or where it can be found. However, just because you figure out how something works doesn't mean you have proficiency in it. So if you do figure out how to use some alien weapon, it might not be more effective than just swinging around an axe or using a bow and arrow. And at number 3, we have visibility ranges. Sometimes when you're trying to look for something in a wide open field or in a large city, you might want to know what are the specific numbers when it comes to what you're actually able to see with your character. And sometimes there's even items or abilities that have to target something that you can see. But how far can your character see? Well, with the visibility outdoor rules, your character can see about 2 miles in any direction on a clear day, or until there's trees, hills, or other obstructions that block the view. And if it's raining, then the visibility is cut down to 1 mile, and fog cuts it down to between 1 to 300 feet. In addition, if your character is on top of a really tall mountain, hill, building, or flying in the air, a character can see 40 miles out on a clear day, with the normal ranges for rain and fog. So if you're trying to track something that's running away from you in a big, open area, you're able to see quite far. And at number 2, we have other activities while traveling. If you're traveling between places, there are rules in place where all party members contribute their passive perception to the travel in order to increase the chance of noticing a hidden threat. However, you are able to forego this benefit in order to perform other functions while traveling, which might help your group. If you're traveling in an area that doesn't have a path or something similar to follow, there is a chance you might become lost. Where if you're in a forest, jungle, swampy area, or some other terrain where there's no land in sight, you have to make a DC 15 survival check or else you get lost. However, if one person in the group volunteers to be the navigator, they remove their passive perception score from the group and are able to perform the survival check necessary in order to not become lost if the DM calls for it. And then there's extra rules about having advantage based on other factors, like having stars in the sky to follow. Alternatively, a character can volunteer to draw a map, where it just simply records your group's progress and allows you to get back on course automatically if you do get lost, without requiring any ability checks. Because if you do get lost, you end up traveling in the wrong direction, and you can't have your navigator perform another check until you get back on course, which takes 1d6 hours. With a map, this becomes instant. You can also have someone designate themselves as a tracker, which allows you to follow the tracks of another creature if you're tracking something on your travels, which has its own set of rules. And finally, the fourth thing you can do while traveling is designate yourself as a forager, where you get to keep an eye out for sources of food and water, allowing you to forage while you're traveling, using the rules for foraging. Now, the reason you rarely see these kinds of rules show up is because a lot of people just kind of hand-wave traveling, where you don't have to worry about any of these things, and generally just arrive at your destination immediately, and then just say a couple of days went by or something. Although if you actually go through all the rules for traveling wilderness exploration, then you're probably familiar with all the things I just talked about. And finally, number 1, definitely a rule you've never heard about, but that could technically be applied to any of your campaigns. And that's the rule for whether or not a whisper can wake you up while you're asleep. You see, there's special rules in Xanathar's Guide to Everything to explain how someone might be woken up by noises while they're sleeping. If there's a sudden loud noise like yelling or thunder, this will wake someone up naturally. Or a creature can use an action to shake or slap awake another creature, which is definitely important for nighttime ambushes. However, what if someone is whispering in the same room as someone who's sleeping? What is required for a character to be woken up by that whisper? Well, if your character who is asleep has a passive perception score that's 20 or higher, then any whispers within 10 feet of them will wake them up. If someone's speaking at a normal volume and you're in an environment which is otherwise silent, like no street noises or wind or crickets, then if the sleeper has a passive perception score of 15 or higher, they're woken up. So there you go. They have special rules for what volume of sound will wake you up based on your passive perception scores, which kind of makes sense when you think about it, which is the case for a lot of these extra rules for really niche and mundane things. Alright, and that's the video. Do you know of any other really niche rules that rarely show up? Did you already know about any of these rules, and if you did, have you used them? If so, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.